Since Jess and I moved to the southeastern region of Australia, the vast stretches of wild nature always seem to call us. There's something about the rugged landscape and untamed wilderness that gets under your skin. That's why, when we decided to visit the Kendall Valley in the Victorian Highlands for a camping trip, it felt like we were answering an ancient call. As I packed up our four-wheel drive, a rush of excitement flooded through me. The Highlands are a serious place. They remind you just how small you really are in the grand scheme of things. I double-checked our list: food, water, tent, rifle for protection, and, most importantly, extra fuel on the roof racks. We were about to immerse ourselves in a land where mobile phones don't work, and the only sounds are the birds overhead. "Ready," Jess called, her voice full of excitement. She's always been the more adventurous one between us. "Almost," I replied, securing the last of the gear. I paused to inform the local police station of our whereabouts, a safety measure you never skip when heading into the unknown. The drive to the Highlands was an adventure in itself. Jess played DJ, mixing classic rock and new indie tunes, which felt oddly out of place with the ancient land around us. The terrain grew more rugged, and civilization quickly became a distant memory. Our conversation faded as we both became absorbed in the beauty of the wilderness. When we arrived in Kendall Valley, I was struck by its raw grandeur. It's an amphitheater of nature, with towering mountains surrounding the valley and a river winding through the middle. It felt like stepping into another world, one that hadn't changed in thousands of years. We found a quiet spot by the river, tucked under eucalyptus trees, and set up camp. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of eucalyptus and the soft murmur of the river. Since it was midweek, the solitude was palpable. We were alone, or so we thought. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows, we sat by the fire. Jess roasted marshmallows, the simple act bringing an unexpected joy. "This is perfect," Jess said, her eyes glowing in the firelight. I nodded, feeling a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. Out here, away from the hectic pace of the world, I felt like we could breathe again. But as the night deepened, a sense of unease crept in. Maybe it was the vastness of the wilderness, or the stories I'd heard of the Highlands, the tales of people getting lost and never being found. I pushed those thoughts away, unwilling to spoil the moment. We were here to escape, to find freedom from worries. But as I would soon discover, the Highlands had other plans for us. Plans that would challenge our courage, our resolve, and our understanding of what it means to truly be alone. The first night in Kendall Valley felt like a dream under the stars. Jess and I sat by the fire, talking, our words flowing like the river beside us. But when the fire died down and we crawled into our sleeping bags, the dream began to shift, slowly turning into something unsettling. In the middle of the night, I woke to a soft thud, like something had been knocked over. I lay there, listening to the silence that followed, my heart racing with mild concern. Was it just a possum or a wombat? We were in their territory, after all. I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. Morning came, serene and calm, but the sense of unease lingered. Our campsite had been subtly disturbed. The chairs by the fire were rearranged, and there, on the ground, was a loaf of bread half-eaten, with a clear bite mark. I could have sworn I'd packed it away last night. "Did you sneak a midnight snack?" I joked, but Jess's confused expression told me something was off. We both knew something wasn't right. As we inspected the area, I noticed footprints near our vehicle. They weren't ours. They circled the car, as if someone had been snooping around, maybe even trying to get inside. My mind raced. Could someone have been here before us? But the clear impressions in the soft dirt suggested otherwise. I could see the unease building in Jess. She's tough, but she has an uncanny ability to sense when things are wrong. "Should we leave?" she asked, voicing the question that had been nagging at me since dawn. I hesitated, weighing the safety of packing up and moving against the effort it would take to find a new spot. "Let's stay. It's probably just wildlife or a curious hiker," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. As the day went on, we tried to shake off the odd discoveries from the morning. We hiked and explored, hoping to recapture the peace we had when we first arrived, but it didn't feel the same. The solitude now felt less comforting. That night, as we sat by the fire, the silence in the valley seemed heavier, charged with tension. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle of leaves in the bushes, made my nerves flare. Jess noticed it too, her eyes flicking nervously into the darkness beyond the firelight. Just as I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, it happened again. A noise in the night. This time, it was clearer. Something was moving at our campsite. I grabbed the flashlight, my heart racing, and scanned the darkness. Nothing. There was no sign of anyone, no animal, just the trees, the river, and the night. But the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, was overwhelming. I didn't mention my fears to Jess. I didn't want to worry her more. We retreated to our tent, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow a potential threat. The vastness of the highlands reminded me just how exposed we were, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our presence here wasn't as unnoticed as we had thought. The next day dawned bright and clear. Jess and I tried to brush off the unease from the previous night, but it lingered. I decided to visit an old homestead nearby, a crumbling relic from the valley's past, while Jess stayed at camp reading. The homestead stood solemnly against the backdrop of the mountains, its walls holding secrets. One of those secrets was a murder from 1917. I felt like I was stepping into a chapter of history. I spent time photographing the place, letting the mystery soak in. Halfway back to camp, lost in thought, I saw Jess walking toward me, her pace hurried. When she reached me, she looked frantic. "I saw him," she said before I could even ask, "down by the river while I was doing the dishes. There was an old man on the other side, with a weathered face and ragged clothes. He looked at me, and then he just disappeared into the bush." My mind raced with questions. Who was he? How had he gotten there? The valley was remote, difficult to reach without serious effort. And why had he vanished so quickly? It seemed like he was trying to avoid being seen. We hopped into our vehicle, desperate to understand what was happening. We drove around the valley, scanning for any sign of the man or other campers, but it was completely empty. Back at camp, the unease from earlier only deepened. The rifle I had brought for protection against wildlife now felt more necessary than ever. Jess and I exchanged uneasy words, trying to rationalize what had happened. "Maybe he's just a hermit living off the grid," I suggested, "or a bushwalker like us, but a bit more rugged." But as the darkness closed in again, every sound in the night seemed ominous. The crackling fire, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, all seemed to whisper secrets about the valley, secrets we weren't meant to know. Sleep evaded us again. The fabric of our tent felt like a thin barrier against the wilderness outside. The night felt alive with unseen eyes, and in the back of my mind, the image of the old man lingered, his ghostly presence haunting the wilderness. The next morning, a sense of dread clung to our camp. The previous day's encounter felt like a shadow hanging over us. Jess and I moved about silently, our usual energy drained by the uncertainty. We decided to leave, but as we packed, a strange reluctance held us back. It was as if leaving would mean admitting that we were scared, that the wilderness had defeated us. Jess needed to use the portable toilet set up a little ways from the camp, so I accompanied her. The short walk through the trees, once a pleasant stroll, now felt like a cautious venture into the unknown. When we returned, we froze in our tracks. There, standing by our campsite, was the old man. The same weathered face, the same ragged clothes. Jess gripped my arm tightly. The man didn't seem surprised to see us, as if our appearance was part of his routine. "Good day, mate," he greeted, his voice gravelly but not unfriendly. I was too stunned to speak at first. "Where did you come from?" I asked. He gestured vaguely towards the valley. "Just over yonder. You lot aren't hunting around here, are you?" His eyes flicked toward the rifle. The conversation that followed was surreal. He spoke of his long attachment to the valley, his visits stretching over decades. He mentioned the scarcity of deer, hinting, "I'm not scared of anything," I shouted to my brother as I slammed my car door, the defiance in my voice aimed more at myself than him. The cold mountain air bit at my face as I turned back, glancing at his worried expression. He stood on the porch, holding my jacket with a smirk on his lips, but his eyes were filled with concern. "Don't forget about the skinwalkers, witches, and werewolves, all the things you should be afraid of," he called out, his voice tinged with sarcasm but laced with real worry. I rolled my eyes and grabbed the jacket from him. "I'm not a kid anymore, Alex. I can handle a few nights in the Rockies," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. It wasn't convincing even to me. I climbed into my old, rusty Ford and shouted, "I'm not scared," before driving off. In my rearview mirror, the mountains loomed in the distance, their outlines dark against the fading light of the setting sun, like ominous teeth ready to snap down. As I drove, the familiar sights of home faded into a blur of green and brown. Lately, I had been sinking into a deep depression, the kind that made getting out of bed feel like a monumental task. Dark thoughts about ending it all would circle around my mind like vultures. I needed an escape, something drastic to break the loop of despair. Mark had suggested solo camping, hoping the wilderness and silence might clear my head. He gave me a list of spots, each more isolated than the last. I picked the most remote one, a campsite 3 hours from the last known spot, deep in the Rocky Mountain National Forest. It seemed perfect. No people, no noise, just me and nature. Mark's reaction when I told him where I was going stuck in my mind. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice shaky with concern. I just nodded in response. "Okay, but remember, it's pretty secluded for a first-timer," he said, shrugging. "It's beautiful out there, but be careful." The drive up was strangely calming, the road winding gently through the trees, leading me higher into the mountains. Felt like a journey into the unknown, an adventure. I decided to leave all electronics behind for this trip, locking my phone in the glove box. I wanted to be fully present, to focus on the now, not the past or future. My plan was simple: 5 days and 4 nights in the wild, hoping it would help me reset, give me a chance to reflect on my life. As I entered Estes Park, the gateway to my adventure, I fought the temptation to check into a hotel. Instead, I found the entrance to the park and continued on to the lot near my campsite. The sun was setting fast, and I cursed myself for leaving so late. The last light was quickly fading as I sat in my car, contemplating whether to hike 3 hours in near darkness. There were 4 other tents in the lot, with room for one more, so I set up my tent amidst families and children who were laughing and sharing food. They offered me hot dogs, s'mores, and beers, and I accepted with gratitude, feeling a momentary sense of community. As I settled into my sleeping bag, I felt at ease, until the campfire's light dimmed and the night deepened. I lay there staring into the blackness, unable to shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. Morning came, and the mountains seemed to push all my worries aside, if only for a moment. The air was crisp, scented with pine, and as I stepped out of my tent, the sun was peeking over the peaks, casting golden light across the land. The campsite was already busy, Kids laughing, parents cooking breakfast. It was a picture of normality, and it comforted me. I packed my gear, feeling less anxious. Maybe this wasn't such a bad idea after all. The hike ahead would be long, but the thought of complete solitude in the wilderness was tempting, like a pull I couldn't resist. The trail was well marked at first, winding through towering pines and past small, babbling streams. I passed a few other hikers, exchanging brief nods, but as I ventured deeper, the trail began to fade, and the noise of civilization vanished. The Rockies embraced me in a silence that was heavy, almost oppressive. In this isolation, I became acutely aware of every breath, every step. It was both exhilarating and intimidating. By the time I reached my campsite, it was late afternoon. I set up my tent in a small clearing, alone in the wilderness, just as I had hoped. No one was around. As night fell and I lit a fire, I tried to relax, but the shadows seemed to stretch and move around me, the darkness deeper than anything I'd experienced before. The sounds of the forest felt wrong. Rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of twigs. It was as if the forest itself was watching me. I crawled into my tent, telling myself it was just paranoia, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound seemed amplified, every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch. I was on edge, wondering if I had made a mistake coming here alone. When dawn finally broke, it brought with it a crushing realization. I was alone in the Rockies, surrounded by untamed wilderness and vulnerable. I hurriedly packed up my camp, the isolation I had sought now feeling more like a weight on my chest. The hike ahead felt endless, the trail twisting and turning through a labyrinth of trees and rugged terrain. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that eyes were watching from the shadows. As the sun dipped lower, I realized I had lost my way. Panic set in as I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest looked the same in every direction. It was almost dark when I stumbled upon a small clearing and set up my tent with trembling hands. The darkness felt alive, suffocating. I built a fire, but the flames seemed to mock me, casting long, grotesque shadows. The night felt wrong, and I could sense the forest closing in around me. Then, as I lay in my tent, the unmistakable sound of footsteps reached my ears. Not the light tread of an animal, but heavy, deliberate footsteps, drawing closer. I froze. My heart raced as the footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, but the figure outside remained silent. Then, just as quickly, the footsteps disappeared. I lay there, holding my breath, listening to the darkness. The next morning, I packed up quickly, feeling like a prisoner in the wilderness. The fear that had gripped me during the night hadn't faded, and as I left my camp behind, the forest seemed to shrink, closing in tighter with every step. Hours passed, and then, just as the sun set, I heard a distant scream, a human cry filled with terror. My feet moved before my brain could catch up, and I ran towards the sound. But as I neared, the scream morphed into a laugh, deep and unsettling, echoing through the trees. I froze. It was a trap, a trick of the forest. I turned and ran back the way I came, panic rising in my chest. When I reached my campsite, I grabbed my things in a frenzy, not caring about packing properly. The mountains loomed over me, their jagged peaks ready to swallow me whole. As I dismantled the tent, I froze. There, sitting in the corner, was a figure. It looked like me, but it wasn't. This doppelganger was gaunt, its eyes hollow and black, its grin wide and unnatural. Blood trickled from its eyes. I stumbled back in horror, and the laughter returned, filling the air. Without hesitation, I ran, driven by raw terror, pushing through the forest, ignoring the pain of branches scratching my skin and roots tripping me. Then, A light blinded me. I collided with something solid. A man, arms outstretched, trying to calm me down. He was dressed in a black suit, oddly out of place in the wilderness. He introduced himself as a park ranger and offered to drive me back to my car. Desperation made me accept, though something felt off about him. His SUV, matte black, idled nearby, its engine growling in the quiet woods. As we drove, I asked him if he was really a ranger, but before he could answer, the SUV jolted to a stop. Ahead of us stood my doppelganger, its broken limbs waving. The ranger muttered something under his breath, and without a second thought, he drove straight into it. The impact was sickening, but the laughter faded away. As we reached the parking lot, the first rays of dawn broke over the mountains. The ranger handed me my bag and a black card with a single number on it. He drove off before I could ask him any questions. I stood there, alone, the card in my hand, feeling the weight of what I had just experienced. I climbed into my car and drove away, leaving the Rockies behind. But the terror lingered, a shadow that would never quite leave my mind. Back home, my brother was waiting for me, relief flooding his face when he saw me. I wanted to tell him everything, to explain the madness I had gone through, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain the unexplainable? So I just shrugged and said the trip wasn't for me. I preferred the cities. The first light of dawn was stretching over the peaks of the Cascades as I packed my trusty old SUV with camping supplies. There's something about the fresh, brisk air of the Pacific Northwest that always stirs a flood of memories. I'm not the energetic camper I once was, but the call of the wilderness, those towering mountains and sprawling woodlands, still pulls at my heart. Solitude has always been my sanctuary, a quality that's deepened with age. The simple pleasure of sitting in my backyard with a drink as the sun sets has become more appealing over the years. Yet, here I was, embarking on my yearly journey into the wild, driven by a blend of nostalgia and an irresistible need for nature's calm. As I drove toward the trailhead, I drifted into reflection, recalling countless past trips. Life seemed simpler then, or maybe that's just the lens of nostalgia playing tricks. The road felt familiar, each turn drawing me closer to a world far removed from daily life's routines. Arriving at a small, secluded dirt lot, I parked the SUV. Stepping out, I inhaled deeply, letting the pine-scented air fill my lungs. The trailhead lay just ahead, a narrow path that snaked through dense thickets and towering trees, offering occasional glimpses of the rugged terrain that made the Cascades so breathtaking. I hoisted my backpack, its weight a comforting reminder of the journey ahead, and started down the trail. The ground beneath my boots was a mix of soft earth and scattered stones, a testament to the untamed nature of the area. Above me, birds chirped in a symphony, their songs a refreshing contrast to the silence I was used to at home. The hike to the campsite felt shorter than I remembered, or maybe I was just more eager. The clearing was perfect, a cozy spot surrounded by a natural wall of evergreens. Setting up my tent, my seasoned hands worked with ease, though my joints complained more than they used to. A sense of peace settled over me, the kind you can only find in nature's embrace. Sitting on a fallen log, I took a moment to soak in the solitude. This was why I came, to disconnect and lose myself in the wild's raw beauty. With the sun still high, curiosity nudged me toward a side path. I had heard about an overlook nearby that offered stunning mountain views. Grabbing water and a few essentials, I followed the narrower, more rugged trail, a thin ribbon of dirt cutting through dense foliage. When I reached the overlook, the sight was breathtaking. The mountains stretched endlessly before me, a patchwork of greens and grays punctuated by jagged peaks. I sat at the edge, transfixed by the grandeur. Time slipped by as the sun made its slow arc across the sky. Returning to the campsite, a subtle change in the air stopped me in my tracks. Something felt off. My tent, which I was sure I had zipped, now hung slightly open. A chill ran through me, not from the cool air but from the realization that I might not be as alone as I thought. Dusk descended, casting long shadows across the clearing. The woods, usually a place of comfort, felt unusually silent. I dismissed the unease, convincing myself it was just paranoia. But the feeling lingered, a quiet tension that wouldn't dissipate. The fire crackled as I brewed tea, the steam curling in the cool air. Yet the night's quiet felt heavier than usual, oppressive even. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. My heart raced as I strained to see through the darkness. The sound wasn't from an animal. It was deliberate, human-like. The footsteps didn't come closer. Instead, they circled, just outside the firelight's reach. My pulse quickened, but my voice felt trapped. Gripping the handgun I'd reluctantly brought, I stood, scanning the darkness. The footsteps eventually stopped, replaced by the natural night sounds. But the damage was done. The woods I loved felt changed, shadowed by an unseen presence. Long into the night, I sat by the fire, listening for more sounds, but nothing came. The once comforting darkness now seemed to conceal something menacing. Eventually, I decided to pack up. Leaving the tent behind, I shouldered my bag and headed for the trail. The woods were silent as I walked, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Reaching the SUV felt like stepping into a sanctuary. Locking the doors, I drove away, leaving behind the darkness and its mysteries. Back in civilization, I reported the experience to local authorities. They were sympathetic but offered no answers. The woods, once my refuge, had shown me a side I wasn't prepared for, a reminder of nature's unpredictability and the secrets it holds. I haven't returned to that campsite. Maybe one day I'll go back, but for now, I'm content to admire the wilderness from afar, respecting its beauty and its shadows. The first light of dawn was just brushing the horizon when Mark and I loaded the last of our supplies into the back of my dusty old truck. The air was crisp, hinting at the scorching day ahead, typical for a summer morning in the rugged forests of Montana. I felt a familiar rush of excitement, the kind that only comes when you're about to leave the noise of civilization behind and immerse yourself in the untamed outdoors. Mark, as always, was grinning ear to ear, his wiry frame practically buzzing with energy. He'd been my closest friend since middle school, sharing my passion for nature. Now both of us, juniors at the local university, had been planning this camping trip ever since the snow started to thaw. Our destination was a hidden lake about 2 hours away, a perfect retreat to disconnect and recharge. The drive passed in near silence, interrupted only by bursts of laughter at our shared inside jokes. When the paved road gave way to a bumpy dirt path and finally ended at the trailhead, it felt like stepping into another world. The forest was dense, its towering trees seeming to close in around us as we began the hike. The trail wasn't much of a path, more like a suggestion, but that's what we loved about it. Wildflowers splashed color across the landscape, and the sound of hidden brooks added a serene soundtrack. We spoke little, each lost in our thoughts, savoring the peace that only nature provides. It was just past noon when the trees opened up to reveal the lake. There it was, calm and untouched, a flawless mirror reflecting the vibrant blue sky and lush green hills. We both stopped, taking in the scene in silence. Moments like these made the stresses of college life fade away. We chose to set up camp under the trees near the edge of the lake, a spot that offered both privacy and an incredible view. Once the tents were up, we rested our legs, grateful for the pause. Everything felt perfect, like nothing could shatter this idyllic escape. That changed when I went to gather firewood later that afternoon. The forest, which had felt welcoming earlier, now seemed to press in around me. As I bent to pick up a fallen branch, I heard a faint sound, soft like a stealthy footstep, but in the stillness of the woods, it was jarring. Straightening, my pulse quickened as I scanned the surrounding trees. A figure stood in the shadows. It was too far to make out details, but there was no mistaking it was a person. They didn't move, just watched. A chill ran through me. This was supposed to be our secluded spot. Who else would be out here? Grabbing a few more branches, I hurried back to camp, my nerves on edge with every rustle in the underbrush. When I told Mark, his easygoing demeanor disappeared. He understood as well as I did that unexpected company in such remote areas was more than unusual. It could be dangerous. We tried to laugh it off, but the unease lingered. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across our campsite, the sense of being watched had settled heavily on us. As the darkness deepened, the comforting glow of our campfire contrasted sharply with the oppressive feeling of the woods around us. Then he appeared. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the flickering firelight, a shadow shifting unnaturally. But as the figure stepped closer, I realized we were no longer alone. He was a rugged man, probably in his early 40s, with an unkempt beard and wild hair. Something about him set me on edge. It wasn't just his sudden appearance. It was the way he carried himself, a confidence tinged with something unsettling. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Evening," he said, his gravelly voice breaking the tense silence. "You know how to get to Red Bluff Trail?" Mark and I exchanged a quick, uneasy glance. Red Bluff Trail? Neither of us had heard of it. "Sorry," I said, keeping my tone even. "I don't think so. Are you sure you're in the right area?" His smile faltered for a moment before returning, but the unease in his gaze deepened. "No problem," he muttered before turning and disappearing into the woods. We sat frozen for a moment, the fire crackling between us. "Was that the same guy you saw earlier?" Mark asked, his voice low. "I don't know," I admitted, my stomach churning. "But it doesn't feel right." The tension grew as the night wore on. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. When the fire burned low and we retreated to our tents, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, listening to the forest's quiet symphony, every rustle making my heart race. Then I heard it, footsteps, deliberate, unmistakable. They stopped just outside my tent. My breath hitched, and I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking. Slowly, I unzipped the tent. In the beam of light stood the stranger, his eyes fixed on me, unblinking. Neither of us moved for a heartbeat. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and ran, crashing loudly through the underbrush. "Mark!" I shouted, my voice trembling. He emerged from his tent, clutching a baseball bat, his face pale. We didn't need to talk. We knew staying wasn't an option. Packing in frantic silence, we kept glancing into the woods, every rustle setting us on edge. By the time we left, the faint glow of dawn was breaking through the trees. We didn't follow the trail back. We cut straight through the forest, desperate to put distance between us and whatever danger lingered. The drive home was silent, our minds replaying the night's events. Over coffee at a diner, we speculated about the man, who he was, what he wanted. But no theory felt right, and the unanswered questions left a lingering unease. The wilderness, once our sanctuary, now felt unpredictable, a place of both beauty and peril. That trip became a story we told often, but no retelling dulled the edge of what we'd experienced. It was a reminder. The wild, for all its serenity, hides its own dangers, and the greatest threats are often the ones you never see coming. The older I get, the less I talk about my childhood in the hills. Not because it was awful, but because there are things that are difficult to explain. I'm 66 now, and I recently came across the show that sparked some memories, so I thought I'd share my story. I grew up in a small cabin nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Back then, our nearest neighbors, the Graysons, lived nearly 2 miles away. Life was simple. We had a few chickens, a couple of sheep, and a vegetable garden that kept us fed. But there was always this feeling in the air. My parents had strict rules about certain things, and as kids, we just obeyed without question. For instance, we were never allowed to stay outside after sunset, no exceptions. If we were playing and the lights started to fade, my mom would ring this old brass bell, and we had to rush back inside. I asked her once why we couldn't catch lightning bugs like other kids did. She gave me a hard look and said, "Asterisk. There are things out there you don't want to run into." Asterisk, another rule was to never wander into the woods alone. The forest began right at the edge of our yard, and it was tempting to explore. My older brother, Peter, and I would sneak in during the day, but we never went far. It was as though we both understood that the woods held secrets we weren't meant to uncover. One summer, when I was about 11, my dad's cousin, Victor, came to visit. We called him Uncle Vic, though he wasn't really an uncle. He was a lively man, always joking and making us laugh, and he didn't seem to share my parents' concerns about the area. One evening, he suggested camping in the yard. "Look at that sky full of stars," he said. Peter and I were thrilled. We begged our parents to let us, and after some hesitation, they agreed, but only if Uncle Vic stayed with us. We set up an old canvas tent in the middle of the yard, lit a small fire, and toasted marshmallows. It was a perfect night until sometime after midnight when I woke up to the sound of rustling outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a raccoon, but then came the unmistakable sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the tent. Peter was awake too. I could hear him holding his breath. Uncle Vic sat up and motioned for us to stay silent. The footsteps paused near the tent flap, and we heard a low growl, deep and unnatural, unlike any animal we knew. We were frozen with fear. The silhouette of a tall, hunched figure moved between the tent and the dimming campfire. It looked like it had sharp ears and a long snout. Uncle Vic gripped his hunting knife but didn't step outside. Eventually, the noises stopped, and we stayed huddled together until dawn. When we finally stepped out, we found huge footprints surrounding the tent, much too large to belong to any dog, and spaced far apart. Uncle Vic told us not to tell my parents, but of course, Mom seemed to know. She gave Vic a pointed look, and he simply nodded. After that, there were no more yard campouts. Over the years, strange things kept happening. Our chickens started vanishing. At first, we thought it was a fox, but there were no feathers or signs of a struggle. The coop's locks were never broken, just opened as if by a key. One morning, we found the coop empty and a patch of coarse, dark fur near the door. Dad took it to the local sheriff, but no one could identify it. At night, we'd hear eerie howls, low and mournful, echoing through the hills. They weren't coyotes or wolves, they were something else. One evening, I looked out my bedroom window and saw large shadows darting between the trees, too big to be any animal I'd ever seen. Mom reminded us again to stay inside at night and away from the woods. One autumn evening, just before sunset, I was gathering apples near the house when I saw it, a hulking figure moving through the trees. It stood on 2 legs but was hunched, with thick, shaggy fur and glowing eyes that reflected the fading sunlight. I dropped my basket and bolted inside. Mom didn't scold me for staying out late. Instead, she locked the doors, and Dad sat by the front door with his shotgun. We waited in silence, listening to the occasional snap of branches outside. After that night, the strange occurrences stopped. No more missing animals, no more howls. It was as if the thing in the woods had moved on. Even so, the rules remained. Years later, as an adult, I asked Mom about those days. She was reluctant to talk, but eventually admitted they believed something, possibly a creature, was out there. She didn't want to frighten us kids more than we already were. Looking back, I still don't know what it was. But whatever it was, it seemed to have its own boundaries. And as long as we respected them, it left us alone. Now, when my grandkids visit and ask for spooky stories, I share tales about the hills but leave out the scariest details. There's no need to give them nightmares. I just hope they remember to listen to their elders, because the world is full of mysteries, and not all of them can be explained. I've always been drawn to exploring places few dare to tread. My idea of adventure is veering far off the well-worn trails into uncharted wilderness. A few years ago, I embarked on a solo camping trip deep into the forests of Washington state. I won't say exactly where, mainly because I doubt I could ever find the spot again even if I tried. I set out early one Saturday morning with a packed bag, a tent, and enough provisions to last a few days. The map I had was more decorative than practical, but I've always trusted my instincts when it comes to navigating the outdoors. After a few hours of hiking, I found a peaceful spot by a brook to set up camp as the sun dipped below the treetops. The following morning, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to leave the faint path I'd been following and venture further into the dense woods. The terrain grew rougher, but I welcomed the challenge. Around midday, something unusual caught my eye, a structure hidden behind the trees. Intrigued, I pushed forward. When I stepped into the clearing, I was speechless. Before me lay a small town. A dozen or so buildings lined a dusty central road. They appeared aged but remarkably intact. A general store, a barber shop, and a town hall, all reminiscent of an old frontier settlement. Felt as though I'd wandered onto a movie set, yet the place was utterly deserted. I called out, my voice echoing back to me. Venturing cautiously down the road, I peeked through windows. The barber shop had chairs lined up but lacked tools or mirrors. The general store's shelves were bare, and the entire town felt incomplete. It didn't seem like an abandoned tourist attraction. There was no graffiti or signs of decay, just a strange stillness. As I stood there, a deep, resonant noise shattered the silence. It sounded like a foghorn, though we were nowhere near the sea. It reverberated for several seconds, then stopped abruptly, leaving a heavier silence in its wake. That's when I heard it. A rapid, clicking noise, like claws tapping on a hard surface. It was faint at first but grew steadily louder. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. My pulse raced as I turned in circles, trying to locate the source. Deciding I'd had enough, I headed back the way I came. But after only a few steps, the clicking grew louder and faster, chasing me. I sprinted toward a nearby building, a small convenience store, and ducked inside, slamming the door behind me. The lock held, and I pressed my back against the door, catching my breath. The store was as empty as the others. Shelves stood barren, the coolers hummed with no contents, and there wasn't so much as an old wrapper in sight. I tried to make sense of it all. Was this some old, failed project? Private property? But the noises didn't fit that theory. The clawing sound resumed, this time circling the building. I crouched behind the counter, gripping my pocket knife, though I knew it wouldn't be much help. As night fell, the scratching grew more persistent, moving from walls to windows and finally to the door. When the doorknob rattled, I held my breath. Minutes passed, and the sounds moved away. Exhausted, I must have drifted off, only to wake with a start to a deafening crash. The door had been forced open, its lock shattered. Heavy footsteps echoed as something large entered the store. A low, guttural growl filled the room, unlike anything I'd ever heard. The creature's sniffing sounded wet and hiss-like, making my skin crawl. It was deliberate, pacing up and down the aisles as it searched. I crouched lower, barely daring to breathe. Then, the foghorn blared again, startling the creature. It unleashed an ear-splitting screech before bolting from the building. I stayed hidden until silence returned, then grabbed my bag and made a break for it. The empty town loomed around me as I ran, but I didn't stop until I reached the woods. I kept running until dawn's light filtered through the trees, exhaustion finally catching up with me. After splashing water on my face at a stream, I realized I was hopelessly off course. It took the rest of the day to find my way back to my car. When I finally reached it, I collapsed into the driver's seat, overwhelmed with relief. I drove to the nearest town without stopping, eager to leave the strange experience behind. When I told friends about what happened, my buddy, let's call him Jake, insisted we go back with proper equipment. 2 weeks later, we set out with GPS devices, cameras, and drones. But no matter how much ground we covered, we found nothing. No clearing, no buildings. The terrain didn't even match what I remembered. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. Did the town exist? Was it a hallucination? Or did I stumble into something I wasn't meant to find? I know it was real, but its disappearance remains a mystery. And I still wonder, what was that foghorn and what was stalking me? I grew up in the rugged hills of northern Vermont, where my family lived far from the nearest town in a cabin my grandfather built with his own hands. This was years ago, in a time when we thrived on self-sufficiency, growing crops, hunting, and living off the land. As a kid, I loved the wilderness and often spent nights camping in the yard or hiking into the woods with my older brother, David. One summer, when I was around 13, David and I decided to camp by a nearby lake. It was a place we'd visited often, about a 3-hour hike from home, and we knew every twist and turn of the trail. We packed light, some snacks, sleeping bags, and essentials, and set off early in the morning. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and a gentle breeze. By midday, we reached the lake, where we pitched a small tent and spent the afternoon fishing and skipping stones across the water. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we built a campfire, roasting marshmallows and trading spooky stories to see who could scare the other more. Around 10 p.m., the fire had burned low, and the forest around us grew hushed, that deep quiet you only get when you're miles away from civilization. As we crawled into our sleeping bags, I heard it, a whistle. Not just any whistle, but a tune I recognized from a lullaby our mother used to hum to us, called Starlight Path. My first thought was that our parents had come to check on us, though that would have been strange since they trusted us to handle ourselves. "David, do you hear that?" I whispered. "Yeah," he said, sitting up. "But who would be out here whistling that?" We stepped outside the tent, scanning the tree line in the silvery moonlight. The forest was still and we saw no one. "Maybe it's just the wind," I suggested. David shook his head. "Wind doesn't whistle like that." The sound came again, steady and deliberate, just beyond the trees. It was neither rushed nor urgent, but it gave me chills. "Let's just ignore it," David said. "Maybe it's some hiker passing through." We returned to the tent, but the whistling continued. It moved, first from one side of the lake, then to the other, always at the same distance, as if whoever was making the sound knew how to stay hidden. After about an hour, the tune shifted. It was still familiar, but not one I could name. It felt as though I should recognize it, but couldn't quite place it. That's when David admitted he was getting uneasy. "This isn't normal," he said. "We should go home." It was late, and hiking back in the dark wasn't ideal, but staying felt worse. We quickly packed the essentials, leaving the tent behind, and started down the trail with our flashlights. The whistling followed us, keeping the same distance no matter how fast we walked. We called out, asking who was there, but no one replied. When we reached a fork in the trail, the whistling abruptly stopped. The silence was heavy and unnerving. We paused, straining to hear any movement. Then, from the path we were about to take, came a low humming, soft and wordless. "Let's take the other way," David whispered. "But that'll add an hour," I said. "I don't care. I've got a bad feeling." I didn't argue. We took the longer path, and the humming faded as we moved away. We made it home just as dawn began to break. Mom was surprised to see us, but didn't ask too many questions, assuming we'd simply changed our minds. David and I never told her or anyone else about the whistling. We didn't even talk about it with each other. A week later, word spread that a local hiker had gone missing near that same lake. Search parties combed the area but found nothing. The man had been an experienced outdoorsman, familiar with the terrain, which made his disappearance all the more puzzling. Years passed. I moved away after high school, while David stayed to care for the cabin after our parents passed. A few months ago, I visited him, and over beers, he brought up the incident. "You ever think about that night at the lake?" he asked. "All the time," I admitted. He told me he'd gone back recently. "Why would you do that?" I asked. "I don't know. I just wanted to hear it again. And the moment I got near the lake, it started. The same whistle, the same tune. Did you see anyone?" "No," he said. "I didn't stick around this time." We sat in silence before he mentioned something he'd learned. The lullaby our mom used to hum wasn't just a sweet tune. It was an old folk song about spirits luring travelers into the woods. "Why would Mom sing that to us?" I asked. Maybe she didn't know, or maybe she did. I haven't been back to those hills in years, but sometimes, late at night, I think I hear that same faint whistling outside my window. I know it's just my imagination. Even so, I keep my curtains closed. Whatever we encountered that night, whether it was a person or something else, I'll never understand how it followed us so perfectly, or why that hiker vanished. All I know is that the woods hold secrets we're not meant to uncover. Most of the time, you'll find me clocking extra hours at a car assembly plant in Michigan. I used to spend my weekends outdoors hunting game, deer, rabbits, you name it. But a few years ago, I was bitten by a tick and ended up with something called red meat allergy. If you're not familiar, it's a condition that makes eating most meats dangerous. For a hunter, it's a nightmare. I never cared much for bird hunting, so that wasn't much of a workaround. The whole ordeal killed my enthusiasm for hunting. Instead, I shifted my focus to outdoor survival and deep woods camping. No allergy was going to keep me from the wilderness. I even thought I might write a guide someday, something to help people connect with nature. One autumn, I decided to take a week off work and head into Black Hollow Woods in New York. I'd been there before, but only stuck to the marked trails. This time, I wanted to explore uncharted territory. I packed up my gear, drove to a secluded parking area, and set off. The first few days were perfect. The weather was mild, the leaves were vibrant hues of orange and gold, and the air carried the crisp scent of pine. I hiked for hours without encountering anyone, eventually setting up camp near a shallow creek. I caught fish for dinner and enjoyed the quiet. At night, I jotted down ideas for the book, though I didn't make much progress. Mostly, I just stared at the fire, lost in thought. On the third day, I decided to head deeper into the woods. I'd heard about some ancient trees up north and thought they might spark some inspiration. Around midday, I stumbled into a clearing that wasn't on any map. The trees formed a near-perfect circle around an open space. In the center of the clearing, I saw them, a group of animals sitting together like they were holding a meeting. A buck, a raccoon, a fox, and what looked like a young black bear. They sat motionless, side by side, all facing the same direction. At first, I thought they might be statues, but as I got closer, I noticed their fur shifting in the breeze. Their eyes were open, yet they didn't seem to notice me. The scene was profoundly unnatural. Predators and prey don't coexist peacefully, let alone like this. I thought about taking a picture, but the idea felt intrusive. Besides, my phone was nearly dead, and I had no signal. When the bear slightly turned its head in my direction, I froze. It didn't seem aggressive, but I wasn't about to test my luck. "All right," I muttered. "I'll leave you to it." I backed away and returned to camp, unsettled by the encounter. That night, the woods were eerily quiet. No insects chirping, no owls hooting, just the crackle of my fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. Around midnight, I heard a faint rustling near my tent. Grabbing a flashlight, I scanned the trees but saw nothing. The sound circled my campsite, slow and deliberate. I called out, "Who's there?" but got no reply. Eventually, the noise stopped, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. By morning, I'd had enough. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to my truck. About an hour into the hike, I spotted something on the trail, a lifeless rabbit. Its eyes were missing, leaving empty sockets. The body was otherwise untouched. I knelt to examine it but didn't touch the carcass. There were no signs of a predator, no blood or tracks, just the hollow-eyed rabbit. Shaken, I moved on, only to find a fox in the same condition a few hundred yards later. Then a deer. When I came across the bear, propped against a tree like a discarded toy, I yelled into the woods, "This isn't funny," but the forest offered only silence. Panic set in. I jogged, then ran, desperate to reach my vehicle. When I finally broke through the trees and saw my truck, relief washed over me. I threw my gear inside and sped off, not stopping until I was miles away on the main road. Later, I told my friend Alex about the experience. He suggested it might have been some twisted prank or ritual, but how could anyone predict where I'd be? I still don't have answers. Even so, I won't let one disturbing experience keep me from the outdoors forever. A tick bite nearly stole my passion once, but I'm not giving it up again. In the late 80s, I found myself at the lowest point of my life, trapped in the relentless grip of addiction. The excitement of partying had faded long ago, leaving only the endless cycle of chasing the next high. This life led me to ruin, penniless, homeless, and adrift. I ended up in the Pine Barrens. For those unfamiliar, the Pine Barrens is an expansive forest covering over 1 million acres in southern New Jersey, a wilderness teeming with wildlife and shrouded in legends. It was the perfect refuge for someone like me, a fugitive with survival skills. Its vastness offered anonymity. I could move my camp without fear of being found. I wasn't alone in the woods. Others, drawn by necessity or desperation, also called the forest home. Many told stories about the area's dark lore, most famously the tale of the Jersey Devil. The legend told of a woman, cursed and bitter, who bore a 13th child, a demon that burst into the world, escaping into the forest. Skeptical as I was, those stories stayed with me. My story happened one autumn as the chill of early frost began to creep into the nights. My connection to the world outside my supplier had been arrested. For days, I endured the agony of withdrawal. Aching muscles, restlessness, paranoia. I felt as though unseen eyes were constantly watching me. To escape the imaginary pursuit, I moved deeper into the forest. That night, beneath the towering trees, the Pine Barrens felt alien. The fire I built gave little comfort. Every sound in the dark seemed amplified, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. Then I heard it, a rhythmic crunching high in the trees. My mind raced through possibilities, an owl, maybe a raccoon, but the noise grew louder, closer. Whatever it was far too heavy to be a small animal. The sound climaxed with a deafening crash as something large fell from the trees. Frozen, I shone my flashlight into the darkness, illuminating massive white limbs. To my relief, it seemed to be just a horse, though its presence was strange. As it turned toward me, the light caught its eyes. Unnatural, glowing red. The animal charged without warning, and I barely leapt aside in time. When I looked again, it had vanished, as though it had never been there. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the forest wouldn't let me rest. Branches above swayed without a breeze, and then something huge moved through the treetops, snapping limbs as it closed in. Panic overtook me. As I fled, I glimpsed the same massive figure again, but this time it transformed. Its white fur darkened to pitch black, antlers erupted from its head, and grotesque wings tore from its back. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, like nothing that should exist. The next thing I remember is waking up on the forest floor in daylight, shaken and alone. I fled the woods and turned myself in at the police station, ready to face my outstanding warrants if it meant escaping whatever haunted the Barrens. That encounter changed me. I cleaned up, earned a degree, and built a new life. Whether what I saw was a hallucination or something real, it served as a turning point. It reminded me that the darkness we carry inside can manifest in terrifying ways when left unchecked. Whether these horrors are of the mind or the world, the line between them blurs when you're trapped in their grip. Beware the darkness, inside and out. My brother has a fantastic RV, and he's always been kind enough to lend it to me whenever I need it. We live just a short drive away from each other in a state that's known for its hiking, camping, and outdoor adventures. It was late fall when I asked him if I could borrow the RV for a few days to go camping by a secluded fishing pond. The weather was getting too cold for tent camping, so the RV seemed like the perfect option. My plan was simple: a peaceful getaway with some fishing and solitude. I went over to my brother's house to pick up the RV, then headed out to the remote pond. The trail leading there wasn't much more than a dirt road, but there were tire tracks, so I knew others had passed this way before. This time, however, the path was deserted, and when I arrived at the pond, there was no one around. I parked the RV off to the side, just in case anyone else showed up. After setting everything up, I went straight to the pond to start fishing. I cracked open a couple of beers and relaxed, soaking in the quiet atmosphere. As it neared 5 p.m., I began packing up my gear, keeping an eye on the surroundings. That's when an old, rusty pickup truck appeared, slowly coming down the trail. It didn't have a camper on it, which was unusual, and the windows were tinted, leading me to believe the driver might be using it as a makeshift place to sleep, something that happened often in this area. The truck parked on the other side of the field and turned off its headlights, staying completely still. With everything packed up, I headed into the RV for the night. I looked out a few times, thinking of walking over to introduce myself and avoid any awkwardness, but the truck never seemed to move. It felt strange to not greet someone when you're so far out in the wilderness, but I decided to just go to bed and enjoy the night. Later that night, I woke up briefly after hearing a car door open and shut. I looked outside but didn't see anything, so I dismissed it and went back to sleep. The next morning, I made breakfast and headed back to the pond for another round of fishing. To my surprise, the truck was still there, exactly where it had been the night before. It seemed like it hadn't moved at all. I spent over 3 hours fishing, but the stillness around the truck started to get to me. It was as if someone was either hiding inside, not planning on leaving, or they had left quietly in the middle of the night after I heard the door. Both options felt off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from inside the truck. As the day went on, I started to feel more and more uneasy. I retreated into the RV, keeping a close watch on the truck from the windows, hoping it would leave. Then, Around 7 p.m., the truck's engine roared to life. My heart raced as I watched it slowly move toward the trail, like it was getting ready to leave. But suddenly, it stopped in the middle of the path, blocking my way. A wave of dread washed over me as a man jumped out of the truck, hurried to the back, grabbed something, and then turned toward the RV. Panic set in as I locked the door, hearing his footsteps getting closer. The man began violently shaking the door, trying to force it open. My mind went blank with fear, and I had no idea what to do. I quickly ran to the driver's seat and started the RV's engine just as the man kept trying to break in. I pressed on the gas and inched the RV forward, bumping into the truck, which caused it to slide off the trail and make a space for me to escape. I drove away without looking back, not stopping until I was miles down the road, feeling a bit more in control of the situation. Only then did I call the police to report the incident. When they arrived, the truck and the man were gone. I couldn't be sure of the man's intentions, but it seemed likely he had planned to rob me, possibly taking the RV and everything inside. But why had he waited so long before making a move? Why not block the path right away and go through with his plan quickly? It felt as if he had been watching me, waiting for the right moment, perhaps trying to see if I was alone and making sure everything was in place. If things had played out differently, I might never have come back.